Democratic presidential hopefuls are facing new calls to release their lists for possible Supreme Court nominees. The group Demand Justice is calling on 2020 candidates to state the types of justices they would appoint before the election. Demand Justice has also released its own list of 32 possible nominees it hopes would be considered for the High Court in a Democratic administration. Let's bring in Christopher Kang. He is the co-founder and chief counsel for Demand Justice. He is also former deputy counsel to President Obama and former special assistant to the president for legislative affairs. Thanks so much for joining us, Chris.
Thanks so much for having me.
So why did your organization decide to release this list now?
So Democratic presidential candidates are out on the campaign trail right now, and they're laying out their vision for the country. And they're offering what are meant to be comprehensive plans for the most pressing issues of the day, whether it's climate change or economic justice or health care or gun violence prevention. But what makes these plans, all of them, incomplete is what I think is the most important issue right now, and that is our Supreme Court. This partisan political Supreme Court stands poised to strike down every single one of these plans. And so we believe that Democratic candidates need to offer their vision for the courts. One way to articulate this is by telling us exactly what kinds of Supreme Court justices they would offer, and so that's why we put out our own list.
Take us through some of the names on your list, Chris. How did you narrow it down to these 32 names, and what were some of the qualifications that you looked for?
So we started this by consulting almost 200 people, academics, activists, lawyers, people with experience covering the court, watching the court, and we asked them, who would your ideal Supreme Court justice be? What are the kinds of people, or literally which people would you put on the court, to make sure that we weren't just looking within our more narrow range of sort of who we know or who we think might be good, but really getting a sense of the wide breadth of the legal community. And we look for people in particular who have been underrepresented on our courts for a long time. I think if you look at our courts, there are a lot of prosecutors, there are a lot of people who've worked at former corporate law firms representing corporations, but they're not nearly enough public defenders or public interest lawyers or lawyers who have represented individual people in court. And those are the kinds of people that we prioritize, people who have dedicated their careers to standing up for progressive values and that we think deserve their chance on the court.
Well, in the spin room following Tuesday night's debate, our Caitlin Huey-Burns asked Senator Kamala Harris about releasing a list prior to the election. Here's some of that exchange.
The issue of the Supreme Court also came up in this debate and hadn't really been talked about at previous debates. We were wondering, would you release a list of potential Supreme Court nominees while running for president?
No, not yet. But at some point, obviously, we'll make that. But right now, I got to win.
So, Chris, Senator Amy Klobuchar also echoed that sentiment. How do you respond to that?
I'm not really sure what the hesitancy is. There's no difference between putting out your plan for climate change or for health care, how are you going to expand health care, and putting out your plan for the court. The Supreme Court is going to decide the fate of every single one of these issues. Now, maybe a candidate doesn't need to put out a list of 32 names, as we did, but they should at least offer the Democratic voters and, frankly, all voters a sense of who some of these people are and what kind of backgrounds do they have, what kind of values do they have, because this is going to be such an incredibly important aspect of the democracy moving forward.
Well, as you know, releasing potential nominees was a strategy that President Trump used successfully to galvanize support among conservatives ahead of the 2016 election. Do you think Democrats should be taking a page from his playbook?
I absolutely do, because, look, when it comes to picking judges, just like on any other policy issue, there's a range of options. You can pick people who are more progressive or people who are more moderate. I think that all of these presidential candidates should tell us, what is your vision for the court? What kinds of judges are you going to put forward? I will say, I think that Democratic candidates are starting to get the message. I think the fact that there was a question at Tuesday's debate on the Supreme Court is an important marker of how far this debate has come. And Senator Elizabeth Warren, in her plan for workers, has said that she would nominate an advocate for workers for the Supreme Court. So I think they're starting to get there, and they just need to take the next step.
At the same time, Chris, when asked, a lot of Democratic voters don't necessarily list this issue as a top priority. Why do you think that is, and how are you trying to change that?
I think part of this is about how we ask the question and how we think about the issue overall. You don't ask voters what's more important to you, climate change, health care, or the White House. right? We ask them about different issues. And I think that we need to start thinking about the courts in the same way, because our courts affect every single one of these issues. If you care about clean air and clean water, you should care about whether the courts are going to uphold regulations to make it cleaner. If you care about health care, you should be looking at this case right now in Texas, where a Republican-appointed judge has ruled that the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional, and that could be headed up to the Supreme Court next year. I think part of this is just having voters understand that the court impacts every single issue they care about, and some of it, quite frankly, is thinking about the way we ask the question.
Well, several candidates have discussed the possibility of expanding the Supreme Court or setting term limits for Supreme Court justices. Where does your organization stand on that topic?
So our organization has a three-part plan to reform the Supreme Court because we believe that it's illegitimate. As we saw Republicans steal a seat from President Obama and then rush through Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation through a sham process that was not consistent with what the founders might have expected when it comes to advice and consent as contemplated in the Constitution, we think that the Supreme Court's very legitimacy is in question. And I will say that voters are starting to say that too, because more voters say that they think the Supreme Court makes its decisions based on politics rather than the law. And so our three-part plan includes, 1, expanding the Supreme Court to add justices to restore balance, 2, having term limits so that justices can no longer rig the system by picking when they retire, and 3, instituting a code of ethics. It is shocking to me, and I think it would be shocking to most people if they realized that the Supreme Court is the only court in the entire country that is not subject to a code of ethics. How any of these decisions are allowed to stand is beyond me.
Christopher Kang. Chris, thank you very much for sharing your perspective with us.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.